I'm happy to welcome you here at the villa, including Jeff Gilbert, who might be in Essex, right? Or elsewhere? Yeah.
Essex.
Okay. Welcome to this IHL Talk. Without further delay, I will give the floor to the moderator, Catherine Fiankan-Bokonga, who will introduce the speakers. Catherine is a journalist, independent journalist, if I don't make a mistake, and a specialist of the topic. She will also introduce in some minutes. You know that sandwiches are next door after the session. Not forget Jeff, but for the others. Thank you for being with us, and I give you the floor.
I wouldn't call myself an expert, but being in Geneva for a couple of years, based in Geneva for a couple of years, and covering all the matters related to UN or the system, I had heard about that cash assistance already, in fact, through UNHCR. So you all know the topic of the day. I think it's a very interesting topic, the use of cash assistance for refugees. We are very lucky. I will first say hello to Geoff. Hi, Geoff.
I can't be there.
Yeah, I hope your mom is doing better.
Up and down. There are good days and bad days.
Okay, so I will start by introducing not a lady, because she will be the first to take the floor, but Massimo, Marelli from ICRC, and Philomena, Cleobury from UNHCR. And because we're running a bit late, you all see Jeff Gilbert, that you can't miss, that's for sure. And we'll start directly with an overview that will be delivered by Philomena about what cash assistance is about, why it has been chosen by UNHCR, and then we'll jump maybe to Jeff or to Massimo, we'll see.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And thank you to Camellia and to the Geneva Academy for the invitation to participate in this panel. I think it's a great opportunity to think about some specific elements and dimensions of cash assistance. So to start off, my particular interest is looking at the alignment between cash assistance as a modality of delivering assistance to persons of concern to UNHCR refugees, internally displaced people and stateless people. And thinking about that and the principles which underpin that decision to deliver assistance in that way, with the principles which underpin international human rights law, international refugee law, and then a little bit on IHL at the end. So by way of overview, I'm a legal officer in UNHCR's Legal Affairs Service with a focus on cash. I work on a lot of the agreements that we put in place with the banks and mobile money providers and other financial institutions in order to deliver cash assistance in a range of modalities. As Kathleen mentioned, cash assistance is significantly being scaled up across the humanitarian community and within UNHCR. So by way of an overview, in 2016-2017, some key figures, UNHCR delivered $1.2 billion in cash assistance, reaching more than 10.5 million people in 94 countries with UNHCR cash programs. And in terms of efficiency, for each dollar, UNHCR delivered up to 93 cents to the individuals. So there's a huge amount of work and support and careful decision making that goes into cash programming. And UNHCR has developed a number of advanced tools in order to support operations when they're developing cash programs. So this includes, for example, the Cash Feasibility Toolkit, which operations use when they're making a decision about which way to pursue the assistance. And in doing that, they would look at a core element is the protection risks and an assessment of the protection risks in that particular operation and for the persons that are being assisted. How can those risks be mitigated and managed? And what are the protection implications for the individual, the household and the community level? We'll also look carefully at what the options are in terms of transfer mechanisms. And so we're seeing a wide range of transfer mechanisms, from far less now in terms of handing out cash and much more in terms of digital, and I know that Massimo will talk a lot about this as well, advanced technology, so looking at mobile money, we're looking at prepaid cards, and I'll talk further about this in the context of the human rights law component, financial inclusion and provision of bank accounts and facilitating the opening of bank accounts. So all of that to say that the effectiveness of any cash programme will be dependent on a careful programmatic design, taking into account the specific needs and contexts of the persons who are being served. And we also must take into account that UNHCR as an organisation provides a huge number of services, so it's not the case that everything can be provided in the form of cash. So looking at the alignment of core principles which underpin the delivery of assistance in the form of cash and human rights, I take us back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 1, which reads, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." So UNHCR adopts what's called a basic needs approach when facilitating refugees accessing meeting their basic needs and achieving long-term well-being through the means to survive and access to services. So the intention from UNHCR side with the basic needs approach is delivering an immediate minimum safety net, and cash can play an important role in supporting this. So key elements would be provision of the immediate means to survive, access to essential services, enabling a protection environment, so looking at the specific protection needs, and that can include an age, gender diversity analysis, looking at a basis for sustainable livelihoods, and bringing us back to Article 1 of the UDHR, providing dignity of choice through multi-purpose cash grants. So this is being anchored in a rights-based approach, and looking at, for example, 3 tangible ways in which this could be implemented. So take promotion of access to national systems and services. So by way of example, I'm currently advising on a number of contracts with banks and financial service providers promoting financial inclusion, because access to a bank account can radically change the situation of a refugee. Looking at identity management, and again, Massimo is the real expert on this, looking at providing a record of a status which helps to protect refugees and gives them access to services and assistance, can help to identify persons with specific needs and help with targeted programming. And then another tangible element linking into the rights-based approach would be the accountability side. So accountability to affected populations, ensuring that the programme, and from my side, the agreement that we enter into with the financial services provider, is designed with this in mind. And that can include a range of measures such as the availability of training materials that the bank or the financial service provider has to provide in local languages, support that they have to make available at specific hours in specific places for refugees, access to complaint mechanisms. So at their core, cash-based interventions, CBIs, are intended to provide refugees, stateless persons and internally displaced persons with dignity of choice in meeting their needs, and human dignity is at the very foundation of human rights. So looking at the human rights normative framework, we could say that beneficiaries, refugees, are of social protection are rights holders, and states and other actors have duties to support human rights. So taking us back to the UDHR, looking at Article 25, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. The UDHR then goes into a range of other rights which are relevant to social protection: the right to the highest attainable standard of health, right to education, right to work. So delivery of assistance in the form of cash can enable persons of concern to determine how they best meet those needs and those of their families. In addition to specific rights, I think that the principles underpinning human rights law are also applicable. So take principles of equality, the principle of non-discrimination, the principle of transparency and the principle of accountability. Taking that back then to the very kind of concrete measures that I look at in the context of the agreements, delivery of assistance in the form of cash can ensure that there is less of a difference between a refugee and another person in the host community. So that moves towards equality and non-discrimination. Transparency: if refugees know the amount which they should be receiving and they can clearly tell if they've not received it, there's transparency in terms of their assistance. And then accountability: we can look at how we get the reporting back from the financial services provider that the money has been definitely transferred to their account. If the money has not reached their account, then you can start tracing the flow of funds and follow up on that. And we can also look at advanced technology, and again, Massimo will look at this, but for example, UNHCR's programs in Jordan and Lebanon look at the use of iris scanning to facilitate the delivery of cash assistance. So then I'm conscious of the time and I don't want to take too much time at the moment, but just to very briefly touch on some of the core principles of international refugee law. Under the 1951 Convention, we could look at Article 13, the right to access property, 17, the right to engage in wage-earning employment, 18, the right to self-employment, 22, the right to public primary education, 23, the right to obtain public relief, and 24, the right to social security. And just running through those, you can see how cash can play an important role in those. So considering the interplay of the delivery of assistance in the form of cash with some of those rights, with cash, a refugee could determine what she wants to buy. She could pay rent. She could use it to purchase equipment, to buy it to start up a small business, buy school equipment for children, so there's not a difference between her children and other children in the class. And with a bank account can receive a salary if she's able to obtain employment. So I see these themes emerging again in the context of international refugee law. From UNHCR's perspective, protection and assistance go hand in hand. In order to be able to fulfil the protection mandate, we have to be able to provide assistance. And in the appropriate context, this can be assistance in the form of cash. And then touching very briefly on IHL, the core humanitarian principles of humanity, so addressing human suffering, and the purpose of humanitarian action being to protect life and health and ensure respect. Neutrality, impartiality, where humanitarian practitioners must maintain quality standards, ensuring that the provision of the goods and services that achieve their intended purpose and without discrimination. And independence. So I tried to bring out some of the themes in the academic discussion and within international law, and then how those relate to a very operational decision by UNHCR or another humanitarian actor.
I mean, it was great. Thank you so much, Philomena. Very quick, but very complete. It gave us also an overview about how a refugee can get his dignity back, because that is part of the target. So I turn to Massimo. Massimo, as an expert also from ICRC, so could you complete this presentation of Philomena?
Yes, well, I'll try. I'm really glad actually to have had this part, the first part that is a very positive part about what cash is, and I want to say right away that I fully agree with all these positive sides. And what I'm going to try to do is probably to give the other side of the coin and the dark side of cash, maybe.
Not too much, because I think that Geoff is also going to talk about the dark part of it. So.
Okay.
Let's keep a little bit of positivity here.
Yeah, okay, well, in order to do that, I'll have to take a couple of steps back and to explain what angle we're coming from when we look at this kind of issues. We're at the Geneva Academy, so I'm not going to be talking about what the ICRC is and the gentleman from Geneva and Solferino. I'll spare you that. But there are a couple of things that are important to underline from the very beginning. Neutral, impartial, independent, exclusively humanitarian. It's an organization that has to rely on privileges and immunities, special sui generis international organization, to rely on its privileges and immunities in order to ensure that it can actually perform its action in a neutral, impartial, independent manner, having access to the most volatile environments of conflicts. So, in all this, there is a sense that where we are, we need to have as much control of the information as we can, because the information about individuals, we know that protecting individuals is also protecting their information. So, again, it's about the status. I'm keen to move on to the next session, to the next part where we really talk about cash, but just to highlight about what the implications of this are from a data protection point of view. Yeah. International organizations not bound by domestic legislations, called by the General Assembly resolution on computerized personal data files, to actually have adopt these guidelines on personal data protection that are set out in those guidelines, and to set up the authority that they consider statutorily competent to ensure the application of those guidelines. This is really, again, to reinforce the importance of having an independent regime that has the full control over the information that it has. So what we did about it, we had our own system of rules on personal data protection, a data protection office, a commission that provides an effective remedy in cases of complaints, and so on and so forth. Why do we do it? Well, We know that we're there to protect the life and the dignity of people. Data protection, if we look at it, it's lots of very legalistic, small, boring provisions about how long you're supposed to keep the data for, what kind of information you're supposed to provide in order to have valid consent and so on. But all those measures are there to ensure the dignity of the individual when it comes to the processing of the personal information. So there's a commonality of interest there, and it's clear that it has some importance for humanitarian organizations when we do things. We started to see, so data protection, in essence, we've been protecting people for a long time, and data protection is about protecting their information. Protecting people is protecting information. We said that. We've been doing this for a long time. Why are we talking about it so much these days? New technologies. There's new developments. It's becoming easier, faster, cheaper to process massive quantities of data, to generate them, to capture them, to store them. What we have today on a USB key, 5 years ago, it was the size of a hard disk probably. And it's now not just a question of piling it all up, you can also make sense of it in a way that maybe a few years ago you had to have thousands of people going through millions of documents, and still you wouldn't be able to make any sense of it, because finding the correlations is not easy for even 1,000 people. Now you have an algorithm that goes through a whole data center and really understands and profiles the specificities of individuals in ways that before was impossible. And so we start to see lots of new technologies coming up and being relevant in humanitarian work. And one of them being cash transfers, for sure. And what is interesting looking at most of these technologies is that actually they involve a little bit of a shift in the humanitarian paradigm, as far as at least we can see it. Before, it was a lot about keeping the control of the information, and it still is about it, but we don't necessarily realize all the time that by adopting these new technologies, it's not us and the individuals we're there for anymore alone, but it's us, them, and a whole host of other processors that are under the jurisdictions of the countries where they work and where they're based. And so therefore the control that we can have on the information that we collect and process is not the same that we had before. This is the main thing that it's probably worth highlighting about new technology these days, cloud providers and so on. Just wanted to mention also the fact that the challenges posed by this kind of new technologies was picked up in 2013 by Privacy International with a very good report in which they highlighted, it was a bit of a slap in the face of the humanitarian sector. They were saying, you guys are really trying to do a lot of very good stuff. You're going to areas where there's no rule of law and bringing new technologies, and you actually don't realize that by doing what you're doing, you're facilitating surveillance of the population that is affected. International Conference of Privacy Commissioners highlights also this kind of issues and the fact that guidance must be provided to the humanitarian sector. And so what we did was to partner up with the Brussels Privacy Hub some time ago, a year and a half ago, 2 years now, brought together a number of humanitarian organizations and agencies, and UNHCR was very active in this working group, and we worked together with UNHCR, with IOM, with the Federation of the Red Cross, a number of other humanitarian organizations, academia, with data protection authorities, because all too often the humanitarian sector decides to sit down and to come up with guidelines without actually checking if they will work with the people who are there to apply those the rules in the sector. And we elaborated a handbook on data protection in humanitarian action, looking at technologies such as biometrics, cash transfer programming, big data analytics, drones, cloud-based solutions, use of messaging apps, to try and provide some guidance as to how to use those technologies in a data protection compliant way. In relation to cash, this is a short summary of our findings in relation to cash. Let's see if we can.
Cash transfer programming covers all types of operations which bring value to beneficiaries, including vouchers of cash and delivery mechanisms such as cards, bank transfers, and mobile phones. It is a particularly effective method of providing assistance, as it gives beneficiaries choice, has the potential to increase financial inclusion, supports local markets, jobs and incomes, and improves transparency, as to how much aid actually reaches the intended recipients. From a data protection point of view, however, cash transfer programming involves the collection, processing, and generation of much more personal data than for aid in kind. Obtaining valid consent can be challenging if no alternative is provided. Furthermore, delivering cash transfer programs requires sharing beneficiaries' personal data with a number of external stakeholders, such as financial institutions and mobile phone operators. This increases risks of incompatible further use by third parties, such as commercial use, but also, potentially, monitoring and surveillance, and uncertainty as to data retention.
So quickly going back to some of these findings, one of the elements that has been mentioned is what is the legal basis to process personal information? If we process on the basis of consent, well, consent is informed, has to be informed consent, so people must be informed about the risks and benefits of a processing operation. Sometimes figuring out what those risks might be is very complex because really it requires a very thorough understanding of the data flows behind it. Who's got access to what information? Does a banking supervisory authority, do the law enforcement agencies have access to banking transactions, to mobile network data? Mobile network data also, if it's a mobile transfer program, it involves not just the generation of who receives the money, but where the person that receives the money is geolocated, at what time is receiving, and a whole series of metadata that maybe the humanitarian organization does not even know is being generated in some cases. So how can a person be really informed about the risks and the benefits? And also it has to be a free choice. If a person doesn't want to actually have all that data generated because they're not comfortable with it, do they have an alternative when they have nothing to rely on other than the cash? We mentioned about the number of stakeholders. A couple of points that I would like just to conclude because I know I'm conscious of time. The idea of financial inclusion is a very important one, and it's really one that is key. What we also need to be careful about in our analysis before implementing a program is that we're not actually going from financial exclusion to financial inclusion to financial re-exclusion in cases where all that metadata is being used to profile individuals for vulnerability, and people might be promoted additional services. Like I was, prior to working in the humanitarian sector, I was working in London at the Office of Fair Trading, and one of our biggest investigations was on payday lending. And it was really people who could not get to the end of the month and were being offered financial services that are at high interest rates and could not get, then got into high debts. Also some ethical questions, even if all this might be lawful or it can be mitigated contractually, you still enable commercial parties to profile individuals based on their vulnerability and to have that information be used to extract commercial value, which is what increasingly mobile phone operators do and financial institutions do. So that is that in and of itself a problem or not? It's a question that I don't think we've really tackled yet, but there's a few new questions that are coming up.
Many questions. Thank you, Massimo. We'll turn now to Professor Jeff Gilbert, that is going to complete the elements about the dark side of the cash assistance, and particularly also the problems that can emerge between communities.
Okay.
So, Jeff.
I'll start by apologising to Massimo because during his presentation, my head must have suddenly taken over the whole of the screen that I'm appearing on. Apologies for that, but Amelia sent me an email saying that I'm not coming through clearly, and therefore I've moved microphones and cameras so that I hopefully I'm coming through clearly. If not, shout now.
Everything's okay.
Great. And apologies. Right. I think I want to take us back to a long time ago, a time when refugees were in camps in the middle of nowhere. And if you've got camps in the middle of nowhere where you're being warehoused by state refuge, cash is useless. Cash only becomes a relevant factor when we move to urban refugee populations, where your refugees have access to banks, have access to shops. It's not much use in the middle of nowhere. So, when in 2014, UNHCR asked me to go out to Niger, Colombia, as part of the research consultancy company. In Colombia, we went out to IDP camp. There was basically from which you could see President Trump's vote. But it was in a place called the Sabrina. It's on top of a mountain. Water was brought in every day by lorry, unmanned tracks. And the idea that you would actually have cash distribution in Alta Florida wouldn't have worked. The IDPs had their own currency, they were working, they could deal with it. But back in 2014, the idea of high-tech transfer just wouldn't have been feasible. We then went out to Niger. In Niger, we went to my co-researcher, Michael Revolutionary. We went out to Marelli camp, which is about an hour outside Cleobury. It's on the edge of the Sahara. Water, again, being brought in every day. But it was a camp for about 4,000 refugees in the middle of nowhere. Then we went out to Deep.
Jeff, sorry.
Yes, listen.
I mean, it's not clear. I mean, we have a problem with the sound.
Right.
So.
Can you just don't move your head?
I will keep my head perfectly still. I can do that.
I mean, even when you're still, but I think you have to be at a good distance of the mic.
Okay,
not too close, not too far.
That better or worse?
I think
Try, go ahead.
I'm speaking now, is that clearer?
Much better?
Yes, much better.
Excellent.
Okay.
And don't move.
I mean, just
I
move your
will
lips.
try not to move. I have to move my lips to talk,
just
but
your lips.
that I think is acceptable.
Okay. We hear you.
Excellent. Apologies. Right. So cash-based transfer is a lot more feasible these days. We went out to a place called Geoff, which is in the southeast. It's 5 kilometres from the Nigerian border. And there, the displaced population was actually living in the town of Geoff, where they were basically working alongside the local population. And it's in those circumstances that cash-based transfer works best. And is better. Right. One good thing, one bad thing. Let's start with the bad thing. When you get a displacement of the population, don't assume that every single person within that displaced population are all from the same background, all have the same ethnicity, all have the same religious background. And quite often what you will find is that the refugee population is itself made up of groups that don't necessarily get on. And therefore accessing cash transfer in shops, accessing facilities where they can actually make use of the cash also depends on minority groups within the refugee population being protected sufficiently that they're not being discriminated against in the same way they had been discriminated against back in the country of origin. So those issues also have to walk through clearly. What I also want to talk through is the current global consultation on refugees. We've talked about 48, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've talked about the 51 Convention and the 1949 Geneva Convention's protocols. What we haven't talked about is the Global Compact on refugees that's currently being discussed. And if we go suppose to, by the way, we expect draft 2 next week. On paragraph 57 of draft 1 reads as follows: in support of host countries, all stakeholders, in particular humanitarian development actors, will ensure complementarity between immediate emergency response and development.
That's for the moment. So let's go to Philomena, and maybe we'll try to have you back a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. I think there'd be a few things. I mean, I think there were lots of great points raised there, and there are a few points that I would like to develop on and also to get feedback on as well. So maybe taking first the points that Geoff had made regarding cash not being appropriate in every situation. UNHCR would completely agree with that, and the tools that UNHCR has in order to make the determination about whether using cash as a means of assistance is the correct one are significant and advanced, and it takes a lot of consideration before a decision is taken that cash is the right modality. And even at that point, then there could be groups within, as Geoff made the point, there could be groups within a refugee or an IDP population for whom cash isn't the right modality. So there'll be vulnerability assessments that happen. By way of an example, it may be that an elderly person would not be able to, or a disabled person would not be able to travel to a bank in order to get cash out. And so conferring a greater degree of dignity comes not from cash in that particular situation, but that has to be part of a process in order to make the determination as to whether or not cash is the right decision. I think the point about camps was an interesting one. I don't have field experience, nor would I profess to be an expert on that, but having spoken a lot with my colleagues who are in the field, who are implementing and designing the programmes, I understand that in the camp context, they're often very thriving markets. And so it is possible to have cash in a camp environment in order to either support those markets, but also give refugees the dignity to make the decision about how they are going to meet their needs. Moreover, I think there's also an argument in relation to efficiency there, that if goods are given in kind, which are not meeting the refugees' needs, there's a risk that those goods will be onward sold for less. And so there's a lack of efficiency there, that the humanitarian actor may have purchased those, but then they're sold for less than was originally spent. And so the refugee or the IDP will make a decision that what they really need is financial assistance. So I think that, just to say, I mean, in principle, yes, I agree that it's necessary to be very careful about it, but I think it's important to use those tools in order to make the determination. Then picking up on Massimo's points about data protection, from UNHCR's perspective as a refugee agency, data protection is paramount. Our registration systems are absolutely key, and we take the protection of personal data enormously seriously. So when a request for proposals is being submitted to the market for a financial service provider, we have a supplementary agreement which deals only with the protection of personal data of beneficiaries. And that's a prerequisite. So when the financial service provider is responding to that tender bid, they see upfront that they have to accept the supplementary agreement. That's been cleared by our data protection officer. And that forms an integral part of the contract. So the contract that we would be negotiating would contain the commercial elements, for example, the price. It would contain the modalities of the distribution, but the personal data, they must comply with that additional agreement. And further, we would also, as Massimo touched on, we would also have specific provisions that prohibit commercial use of the data and onward transfer of the data. And I agree that it's not as straightforward as that, and you have to look at, there has to be due diligence in considering, is this an appropriate financial service provider with whom we're going to be engaging? But that definitely is part of the process. So I think all that to say, it's obviously a fast-moving field, and there are areas that are going to be developed that, probably in 6 months will be further than where we are just now. But I think it's important to to be aware of those risks, and as lawyers to try and think about what can we do to mitigate them, and also to leverage them as well. Think of new technologies actually may confer ways of dealing with data more securely. So those would be the two main points I would make.
Thank you. So Massimo wants to react, but I want also to ask a question. What about the mobile provider? Because what we often see in the field is that an agency or an NGO is providing mobile phones to the refugees or the IDPs in order for many things, to be in contact, to get money. And what about that provider? Because we all know that when we have a mobile and we put some numbers in it or some infos, the day you lose it, you can get back to your data, or if it's the same brand, I mean, you get all the information with your WhatsApp conversation and everything back. So what about that? What are the kind of legal agreements that you have with these companies?
So I think that takes us actually into the point about financial inclusion, because in certain contexts, actually, access to a mobile phone and access to the accounts on a mobile phone could amount to financial inclusion. And in that context, we would see that as facilitating the refugees' access to the market. But our data requirements would remain. So if we have an agreement with a financial service provider that we will be transferring assistance by means of a mobile money service, we still have our data requirements.
So, but you're not sure what they're going to do with that data because you don't have the control of it. Well, and also, how do you make a choice? Is it, for instance, a Chinese mobile company? Is it a European one or another country? Are you making a choice, I would say, in the brands?
Yes.
And how do you make the choice?
So the provision of financial service providers is subject to the procurement process, which is subject to the strict rules of UN procurement processes. So in the normal situation, there would be what's called a request for proposals, which goes out, which is hugely detailed, sets out exactly what the programme is that we're looking to implement, and requests bids from mobile companies, or if it's mobile money. Sometimes it would be more open than that. You would say, well, could we have a range of proposals as to how we can deliver assistance in this context? So then there's a due diligence process that happens with regards to the offers that are received. So the company will normally submit a large amount of information with that, which could include their accounts, it can include their company reports and so on. That due diligence process happens, and it goes through the normal procurement process in order to determine that this is the entity with which we would be contracting. So it's not just a kind of finger in the wind decision. Yeah.
So Massimo.
Yes, so also to complete the picture, when I was highlighting some of the challenges that we've identified, it's not to say that cash is bad. Cash can be very good or very bad, depending on where it is done and how it is done. And understanding where it is appropriate is key. And really, for me, it's very important that analysis of appropriateness. The only problem that I see with cash so far is in the analysis of appropriateness. What I have seen so far, and I don't have a global overview of what's happening out there, but what I have seen so far is that in determining whether it is appropriate to go for cash or not, the analysis is about, is the market sufficiently mature? Are there suppliers? Are there shops? Are people able to go and buy? And I haven't seen so much what we're trying to integrate in data protection impact assessments, which is it appropriate based on the vulnerability of the individuals and based on what the information that is being generated can be used against them for. And so we're trying to integrate these in our analysis. It's really not easy. It's not easy because it really requires a very thorough understanding of what data flows are being generated by a particular program. And it's not just it's not simple because providers are not transparent about what kind of metadata they're generating. It's not very clear. In some places, even if the law says something, we know that there are other things that happen behind. I was doing a data protection impact assessment in one of our operations that I should not name, where it was post a cash program. Simple things. Simple things. Following the implementation of a cash program, we're going with ad hoc post-program interviews. the family member of one of the persons that we interviewed was arrested because it emerged. This person re-emerged as being on the records, and it was a person that moved from a non-government controlled area to a government controlled area, and so that person was being identified thanks to his presence in the financial system. Other people that had debts with another bank, for some reason it was not foreseen and it's not within the law, but there was an exchange of information between the banks. The following day the program started, they were being chased and harassed by the previous bank to repay the debt. An account holder who had a debt with the same bank was actually not receiving the payments that we were giving them because the bank was deducting what we were giving from their debt. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, it's just that it's stuff that we need to take into account when we implement the program, because we need to know that the money that we're giving people to live until the end of the month is not actually going for that. So it's really an analysis that was quite complicated, and it's an analysis that involves also a careful understanding of what metadata is being generated. So if we know that the mobile network or the financial system is being controlled by the party to a conflict. This is particularly the case with IDPs, not necessarily with refugees, but other challenges arise with refugees. One of the parties that actually is at the origin of the displacement, well, actually, all that system is providing such a huge amount of information about movements, concentration, consumption patterns of a population that is of high interest to that party. And that, I think, for me, beyond the implications directly for the individuals, is also something that calls into question the neutrality of the organization. I mean, what does it mean to be neutral in a digital environment when the humanitarian sector is generating so much information at the hands of potentially one of the parties? And it's not to say that that's always the case. It's just to say that in our analysis, we really need to be very, very thorough, not just about the market conditions, but about what is the data flow? Who is having access to what information? What knowledge with big data, data analytics, these entities can extract on the target population? Is there a vulnerability that is specific to that population in relation to which that knowledge is going to be problematic? Again, IDPs might have certain vulnerabilities that refugees may not have. Refugees may have others. Families of refugees in home countries or in the countries of origin can have vulnerabilities that we need to take into account as well. It's extremely complex.
Yeah, so we'll try. Thank you, Massimo. It's true that it's very complex, and we can talk about the example of Syrian refugees that had to experience that cash system in Turkey, because as many of you know, certainly the Turkish government decided to build camps for the Syrian refugees, and they provided them with cash assistance made in the form of credit cards, like a credit card, but they were only, and they are, because it's still on, allowed to get in specific shops. And they say that the discrimination is at that level, because everybody knows that this shop, that shop, and that shop is for refugees. So that it's another way, it's not an integration, but in fact, it's more, how do you call that? Like an discrimination and stigmatization. Yeah. So we'll try to get back to England. Geoff, are you still on?
I am still on. I can hear you clearly.
Okay.
I don't know whether you can hear me clearly.
Yeah.
That's better.
Right. I have no idea what has changed. However, I was only going to pick up on 2 points. One of the examples I gave were just to show you that you've got to take into account a whole range of factors that sometimes have nothing to do with sort of data protection or what counts. There's a whole range of markets that do exist in camp situations, and there, yes, cash can be just as good. But in the case I was talking about in Niger, that would not have worked at all. So as Philomena pointed out, UNHCR does do this process of checking to see whether cash-based transfers are appropriate. There was one other point which I don't think that has come out. It goes back to the Global Compact on Refugees. what we're trying to do is make refugees part of the local population during protracted displacement. They're trying to be integrated so that the local population and the refugees can work alongside each other and there's no discrimination at any level. One of the problems can be how you set the amount of cash that you're going to give to a displaced population as against the local income level. And can refugees, therefore, actually be receiving more than the local population will be earning through aid? And that's something else that the UNHCR has to take into account, because sometimes the figure that is established that a refugee is entitled to, okay, has a right to, is actually way higher than the local population, and that can cause disparities as well. So it's not just discrimination against refugees, there can be discrimination against local populations. And it would be very interesting to do some research there on what's called the Cox's Bazar, because there are India and the local population in Cox's Bazar, vis-a-vis incomes that might be set for Bangladesh as a whole, because of disparities between different countries. At which point I would go quiet again and hope that that was a lot clearer, but I have no idea. At least put thumbs up or thumbs down or hands waving.
We've been able to catch a few words.
Oh.
Yeah. So, any one of you want to say something? Maybe we're going to turn to the audience for questions. Okay, gentlemen, be nice enough, please, to introduce yourself and tell to whom you're addressing your question, even to Jeff.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Samuel Almaide from Africa Mission in Geneva. Thank you for inviting me to this very important meeting. Just to give you this background, my country is also implementing cash-based interventions. As you know, we're hosting close to 900,000 refugees. We're introducing cash-based interventions, and I really hear very much that cash-based intervention is very cost-effective, very transparent, and we look forward to further scale it up. Probably some 2-3 points to comment. The first one is, I think it's very important that we link it with commodities available within the host community. That really promotes the problems, that really addresses the problems raised with regard to discrimination of host communities. So that's one point. The other point is it's very important to ensure that the cash is used for the purpose that it is intended for. There are some practices of using cash for social, for drug and other stuff. So I think that's very important to address those concerns. The third point is we need to have some needs assessment availability of commodities, as has been mentioned. Some of the refugees in our case, for instance, are in camps where these camps are located from in a very far place from towns and urban areas. So that's one point. But there are also some challenges regarding it may cause inflation, a very localized inflation in some areas, because it will create scarcity of commodities. A lot of money chasing for your products. So I think soil assessment is one challenge. The other is presence of financial institutions. I think we need to consider microfinance institutions and smaller banking and finance institutions and disbursing cash assistance. So I think this needs to be carefully taken before introducing cash-based intervention. That's what I just have a question for Massimo. You raised some questions about people being detained based on information gathered from financial institutions. What solutions do you think this will address, in, especially within the context of national rules and policies regarding financial institutions? And how grave is this problem, given that cashless interventions is now one of the best solutions, which we look forward to further improve this curve in the future. Thank you.
So
Yeah, of course.
should I address, so first of all, actually, I really also wanted to comment on your observation about the inflation concerns and the market forces, and I think this is one of the key factors to take into account at the planning stage. And I did a few distributions and economic assistance activities in the field in some of our missions. But I was really glad that that was not my main task, because understanding really market forces and exactly how to do it right is a nightmare, even with in kind. I remember after, we knew it very well, but you go with the prepared kits where you think this is what people are going to need, and you have all the things, the tools, and then the following day you already expect that, but the following day you go back to complete something and you see everybody going to the market to sell the things that they didn't need, to buy other things. So in that sense, probably cash is more efficient, but then it's true, market forces really require experts to do them. I'm glad I didn't have to do it. On the risk of people being identified and arrested, I'd like to be clear also about the fact that it's the problem is not that the person got arrested. There are national laws that apply, and it is the task of the authorities to make sure that the laws are applied. The problem is that in that case, it is not the task of a humanitarian organization to highlight who those people are. The purpose of humanitarian action has to be exclusively humanitarian, and in order to remain neutral, a humanitarian organization cannot be a vehicle for the identification and the capture of these people. Whether it is a problem, it depends on the context. It depends on whether, as I was saying earlier, are we talking about IDPs, so people who displaced within a particular territory, and so they are already at the center of the attention of certain authorities, or are we talking about a population that has found a safe place to be, and so it might be less of a problem. It's really a very factual analysis, and so when colleagues ask for advice at the headquarters, what we can do is not to tell them, yes, here it is the right thing to do, or there it's not the right thing to do, or here you should actually use another model. It's to guide them through the thinking process and to get them to ask all the questions, including all the possible mitigating measures, certainly contractual clauses, as you highlighted.
He's back.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping that this works better.
It worked better. So, I was saying the risk analysis process and contractual clauses are certainly one of the many mitigating measures, but what we would also integrate in our analysis is how credible is it that the supplier will comply with the contractual clauses? Is there a system of rule of law whereby if they do not comply, we can take them to court? Do we have the budget and the staff to take somebody to court if they do not comply with the clause? We really need to think all this through, and we cannot just rely on the fact that they agreed to sign something. So it's really...
Have you already have cases of people that are, in fact, want to sue someone because there has been a misuse of the data, or that it affected the family, or that someone has been arrested? Have you had cases? Because
not of people wanting to sue, but of people being arrested or people being subject to commercial pressures.
Yeah, but due to the fact that, in fact, they had provided personal information to an NGO agency or whatever, and that has been misused, or is that the scenario?
It's very difficult in this kind of cases to make the link so directly, because to get the evidence that of causality is very difficult. But generally, what people come and tell you is that yes, there is a link.
Yeah, but because what you told us, for someone that is, for instance, had some debts, and that suddenly the bank comes and takes the money, that means that they had the info that...
Yes, but in that case, the bank with which they had the debt did not say the other bank called me up and they told me.
No, of course, smart enough.
Exactly, so what I'm saying is there's no direct evidence, but the link is so close that you can assume that the link is tight.
Jeff, what would you like to say about that?
I think there are... Oh, is that better or worse?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I think that one of the problems with trying to implement any process in a humanitarian situation is that the idea that it's going to be like going down to the court in Geneva and being able to go through a proper process with lawyers on both sides, that doesn't happen. It's going to be a lot more. You're going to have to play it by ear, and we're very early on in the cash transfer system. We're still in the first few years of it. So this idea that we've already sorted out all the problems that Massimo's been suggesting and telling us about. That's going to take another 5 to 10 years to sort out. But as Philomena has pointed out, as Massimo has pointed out, and as I've seen in the field, cash is the way forward. It works better than the other mechanisms. It's not perfect. But what happens quite often is you try something new, and because it's not perfect, you immediately say, oh, let's go back to the old system, as though that's better. And I have news for you, I don't think that's going to happen. I think, but as Massimo has pointed out, we've got to take into account all these things that go wrong now and have regular lessons learned and the organisation sharing. We're going from an era where the humanitarian actors didn't share practically any information with the government to an era where they're going to have to share a lot of information if they want to use cash transfer.
Mm-hmm. So,
is that it?
Thank you, Jeff. What we're asking, in fact, so I'll get back to the audience, to the gentleman. Please, could you introduce you? Yeah.
My name is Joseph Ashmore. I'm IOM. I work on shelter settlements and cash programming in the Department of Operations and Emergencies. I think it was interesting, this discussion about refugees, about host communities and IDPs. We also have non-registered refugees and migrants. And I think when we start looking at service providers, there are clear examples where we get exclusions. But I'd be also interested to know what data protection related issues there are in relation to those two groups, or if you've come across specific data protection related issues related to non-registered refugees, other people of concerns, migrants, as kind of sometimes actually more vulnerable groups, or groups with specific relevance.
So, who wants to start with? Massimo.
So I haven't actually personally come across specific issues. I wouldn't, like, if colleagues were coming with a case where a use case for saying I'd like to implement a cash program there, what kind of questions should I ask myself? But then we would really need to look at the specificities of the context to see what vulnerabilities applied in that place. I would imagine that these would be people who would have the tendency to prefer to be under the radar and not to be really registered and monitored and tracked. So I would think that they would want to do that for some reasons, and I think it's difficult in that kind of case to go and talk about informed consent, because if you're going to propose a cash program to a person that doesn't want to be on the radar, and you tell them this is the only way to actually get to survive, they're going to have to take it, and that's not free consent. But and then the specificities, I mean, what kind of, you could also, there are lots of scenarios in which the financial institution that might be providing the cash is actually a subsidiary of another financial institution in the home country. It's really complex. It really requires a careful analysis of what data are we talking about? What data is being generated, including metadata, geolocation, and so on? Who has got direct access to the information? Who has got indirect access to that information? And it's really difficult to do that. As I mentioned, it's at the center of the work that we're currently doing with Privacy International. That is a civil society organization advocating for privacy, and that has a lot of experience in litigating on surveillance programs. And
No.
okay. And so what we asked them to do is actually to help us out, to really look thoroughly at this metadata environment that is very complex, and to devise a risk analysis table for us to then actually enable us to navigate this complex environment and to be able to ensure that we come up with cash where it's appropriate, and we come up with the right cash to make sure that we mitigate as much as possible. Always bearing in mind that it's true, cash has all its advantages, but because of the potential disadvantages, there might be situations where the mitigation is not sufficient, and for those situations, we have to be prepared to say cash is not the right thing for this situation. But we're doing airdrops in South Sudan, and it works.
Because I want to complete what you just said. For instance, you have refugees that go through the process to be registered by UNHCR system, and then they have access to certain services. And then you have refugees that are, for instance, living in local communities, which has been the case for many years in Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire has never had camps. They never had camps, and the country never had access to financial support because they had no camps. So now you have to see also, when we take the case of Lebanon, refugees are, a lot of the people of refugees are in the communities. So my question was, do you have to be registered as a refugee in order to have access to that kind of service?
So I think that would it would depend on the context, and I think just going back to the point coming out of your question and also the other gentleman's question, what's coming across here is the need to situate cash within the whole programmatic design. So you're looking at who are the persons that are being served here. Is it appropriate that if, for example, they are registered refugees, are these people that, for example, the government may be able to recognise the identification that UNHCR provides that would facilitate them opening a bank account? That's not going to be the case in every context by any stretch of the imagination. Likewise, are there protection risks that require advanced monitoring and evaluation as a follow-up? So I think the important thing is to see cash as part of a holistic range of services and not a panacea to everything. And I think that takes you to, also your point about looking at the local market. Is it going to flood the local market? Is it, are the right commodities available? So I think a lot of the comments that are coming out are demonstrating the importance of seeing the cash programming as part of that broader picture, including who the populations are that are being served.
Massimo.
No, it was just to complete what one of the things that I was mentioning earlier. If there are concerns about tracking, profiling, it doesn't mean there are still some modalities of cash that are actually really good, and we should not forget the first cash modality, which is cash in envelope, and we're really talking about cash.
Yes, cash. Real money. The lady here on the second.
Thank you. My name is Antje Hall. I work at the Permanent Mission of Switzerland here in Geneva, and as for Switzerland, they've always been pushing, for cash for quite a long time. And as Professor Gilbert was saying, I think it's the way forward. So my question, therefore, is, I'm not sure what are the latest figures in the cash, but I heard last year, I think we were talking about like 7% of like the whole total community assistance of cash. So it's still a very little small amount there. So what are the bottlenecks? I mean, from our general perspective, coordination is a big issue, but are there other impediments? And then my second question was about protection risk. You said that, in several interventions there were reference to the fact that cash programming could compound discrimination among refugee groups, but also between like refugees and host communities. So, but wasn't that already the case with in-kind assistance? So what is very different with cash? Has it really compounded that risk? And so on?
So,
sure. So on the first one, I would say, I think you have to look at it geographically. I think I don't have all the figures immediately to hand, but I think that there are certain regions where cash, the percentage that's being delivered in cash is far greater than in other regions. And I think that probably speaks to the importance of carrying out careful analysis as to whether cash is the right way to move. So I think that's part of the bigger discussion that we've been having, but I know that there are a lot of colleagues within the organisation who are working very hard to empower the colleagues in field operations to be able to deliver cash if that's the appropriate modality. In terms of protection risks, I think the point that you make is very good, and there's actually on UNHCR's website there's a video clip from Jordan where it's a mother who's talking about how being able to how the receipt of cash assistance basically enables her children to go to school. And when they go to school, it means that she doesn't have to have a child who's working. And when the child is at school, she's able to buy the same notebooks as everybody else. So that's quite a kind of concrete example of non-discrimination flowing from cash, whereas if it had been aid in kind, it might have been a branded assistance, for example. So I think there are ways, again, if you look at it as part of the overall programme, that it can be that those protection risks can be mitigated.
Massimo?
Yeah, so I was at I think we read the CULP launch, the CULP annual report launch, and I think at some point there was, it was mentioned that, is it 10% of the, at the stage, 10%? And I think in the analysis that was being presented, if cash was to be used in all cases where it is appropriate, it would get to constitute about 20% of the total amount of aid. And I raised the question there, and I raise it still today. So, what do we take into account when we say that if it was used in all appropriate circumstances, it would be 20%? By appropriate, is it just a market analysis that we're doing, or are we also considering all the other risks that I tried to raise earlier? And my understanding of the answer was it is just market forces and the appropriateness from that point of view and market readiness. So it's because the humanitarian sector has not really yet integrated all this thorough analysis of all the other protection concerns, at least in a systematic way.
Mm-hmm. And we haven't spoken about amounts. What is the average amount that is given to the refugees or IDPs per month? If you compare it with local communities, like Jeff said, if there are problems, that means that in a certain way, the refugees or the IDPs are earning, in quotes, more than local communities. So what is the average that you're giving? How do you decide about the amount?
So again, that's part of the market or the assessment tool that's taken place that takes place with the programme officers before they do, or in the process of designing it. So they have what's called the basket of assistance that they would be looking to provide and go through and say, in an ideal world, this is the assistance that could be provided. But as I understand it, actually, in the vast majority of cases, the assistance that is available is not going to get to that level. So it's a combination of first setting out, these are what we would like to be able to provide, but then you have to look at what the resources that are available are. Yeah.
Gentlemen,
thank you, please. I'm Massimo from Solidarity, a Swiss-based fundraising organization. A question to the UNHCR. UNHCR collects data, assists host governments to collect data, or does it on behalf of the host government? Because the host government has a legitimate grasp to know who's in the territory, of course. So that also means that we don't really control the use of your data, because you share it with the government. So what are new data protection policies worth then if you actually share this information with the local authorities? This may be a problem when there's a strained relationship between the refugee population and the host authorities. So how do you handle those issues? And issues are actually more complicated when you have richer data sets, like when you cash programming. If you just have names and whatever it is, fingerprints things so easily.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched a little bit on that earlier. Obviously, the protection of data and registration data is hugely important to UNHCR, and there we have a very strict data protection policy. It actually goes beyond the context of cash programming, because if you look at the information that we collected in the context of an RSD interview, for example, you will have a lot of very sensitive information about individuals. So that is taken hugely seriously, and there's a strict data protection policy. And in relation to the relationships with host governments, it's obviously the primary responsibility. UNHCR is there to facilitate and assist under the convention, but it's something that's of enormous importance, and the policy covers a lot of that. And if there is if there is specific data sharing, there would be specific agreements that would be carefully thought through, including, for example, in the context of cash transferring, cash programming, we would be looking at what's the information that's necessary to be shared with the FSP for the purposes of the cash assistance. So we would not be sharing more information than is necessary.
Yeah. Massimo, something? No? Please, the lady in the back of the room.
My name is Jeff. I work with the International Canadian Red Cross in a different area.
Hello.
Thank you to the panelists. I don't work on cash transfer issues at all. I'm an international lawyer, so this is a question of general interest to me. But I wanted to come back to Philomena's presentation at the beginning of the panel and ask, well, first of all, to say my reflection is that it seems that international law is a permissive mechanism in terms of cash transfers, because there are lots of principles in different areas of international law that suggest that cash transfers can help meet rights and meet obligations under international law, and that if there are any restrictions necessary, those restrictions seem to be imposed via contractual mechanisms, so not public law mechanisms, but rather private law mechanisms. But we have heard from Massimo and Jeff that there are risks associated with cash transfers. And my question is international law a source of law when it comes to restrictions on cash transfers? And is it a source of law when it comes to reacting to the risks or the, let's say, negative consequences of cash transfers? And I'm thinking of IHL, IHRL, and international refugee law, as you mentioned, but also the body of international law known as international security law, counterterrorism law, for example. So I wondered if you could talk more about the restrictive nature and reactive ability.
Yes.
It's a big question, I'm sorry.
It's a very big question and a really interesting one. I think it's something I would want to reflect more on. I think I'm, at the moment, been looking at the kind of how you marry the operational dimension, which, as you say, is very much based on private law. It's the agreements that we're entering into with the principles that underpin human rights law. But I think you're right. We should be looking also at, you know, where would the boundaries come, and how would you think about it from the other side? I don't have a quick answer to it, but I think it's a really interesting question, and certainly something I'd like to think about more.
Jeff, don't walk away. We need you.
I wasn't walking away. I was trying to find out whether I had an email from Camelia telling me whether it was going better or not, because I moved away from the computer.
So I think it's better now. Sounds better.
Okay.
So would you like to react on that?
Unfortunately, while I am better, questions from the floor are inaudible, so you have to repeat the question.
So could you please repeat your question?
Yeah.
Or Philomena will say what she said, and so maybe you'll be able to complete.
So the question is whether international law acting as we've looked at it as a permissive tool for enabling cash assistance. Are there restrictions that a matter of international law in how cash transfer programming can be used, should be used? So we've looked, from my side, I've been focusing more on the restrictions from the private law, at the private law level, where we're looking at the contracts and the agreements with the banks and financial service providers. But would there be restrictions that would come at the international level?
Well, again, the starting point is going to be international human rights law.
Yeah.
And then you're looking really at the obligations that have been accepted by the state of refuge. Because there's a whole series of problems about whether an international organisation can be held accountable for human rights standards. But where would you take UNHCR to before the Human Rights Tribunal starts off with? So let's think about Arcadia, which is the state of refuge. What treaty obligations has it undertaken? It's clearly going to have, if it's ratified anything, obligations regarding privacy. So those issues, again, we go back to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and ideas about access to work, access to housing, all those ideas about what could cash transfers facilitate in those circumstances, and whether you actually have rights with regard to a cash transfer. I don't think you can have rights to a cash transfer. I think what you are entitled to as a refugee is the international protection that will be organised between UNHCR and the host state. And if cash transfer is the system in place, then it's as Philomena says, there will be a private agreement between UNHCR and the state of refuge as to how that cash transfer system is to be put in place. And that will then depend on local law. I'm not certain international law takes us that much further at the individual level.
I think just add, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Jeff, I cut you off.
No, go for it.
I think at the private law level, what we do have in the contracts to facilitate the delivery of cash will be greater reporting requirements that would enable, in the context of a refugee or a person of concern receiving assistance, we could track through if that assistance has not reached them, and then that becomes a measure that we can use to take an action against the financial service provider or raise it with them, hopefully not actually taking an action. And just picking up actually on something that Massimo mentioned, I mean, one element that we're looking at in our contracts are things like key performance indicators. So you're not having to kind of take the extreme option of actually, in our case, it wouldn't be going to court, but going to arbitration in order to enforce a contract. But rather, if something has not gone well, we have a series of measures in the contract that these are standards that the FSP, the financial service provider, has to adhere to. And if they're not doing that, then we have a platform, a contractual tool to go and say to them, look, this is what you need to be committing to. You need the transfers to happen within this time period. You need to make sure that your cash out agents have sufficient liquidity and so on. But those would be mechanisms between us and the financial service provider.
Massimo.
So if I understand the question correctly, we saw earlier about what are the principles of international law and the fundamental principles of humanitarian work that are furthered or that can actually help or justify cash, and you're seeking to see what might be the principles of humanitarian work and the international law areas that actually would be challenged by cash, and in relation to which some constraints might be imposed. And I think we picked up on two already in the discussions. The first one is when we talked about the neutrality, all this generation of information that is handed over potentially to one party, but and then the other one is the fundamental right to a private and family life. And for where it is recognized as such, which is an increasing number of countries, the fundamental right to personal data protection, which is derived from the right to privacy. So whether they would push to say that cash is right or not, it would depend very much on the context. So it's in some cases cash furthers those humanitarian objectives, in some others it goes against those humanitarian objectives and principles, and it's all about a factual analysis. And so this is why, again, the specific risk analysis in each case is fundamental. There's no way around it. And I mean, these days at privacy conferences, you get to very complex discussions about principles and about new technologies and everything. And at the end, when there are no answers, there's always somebody that closes the discussion with, the solution is a data protection impact assessment, and everybody goes nodding. But it is true. It is true.
Is it okay for you? Yeah. Another question? Yes, please.
So my name is Gianluca, and I'm from the UK mission. So we saw that cash system can be a way to give dignity, to recognize the dignity of refugees, and also a very flexible tool. But do you have within this framework any mechanism to ensure that within each household a certain amount of money is spent on people with certain specific needs and vulnerabilities, and when thinking about people, for example, with disabilities? And also within this framework, cash that you give can be spent on certain areas that can be contentious, such as sexual health. Do you have any mechanism to ensure that there is enough money for certain people with specific needs in certain areas?
So there could be, when the programme is being designed, it could be either multi-purpose cash intended to cover a wide range of needs, or it could be more targeted. So it could be, for example, cash for health or cash for education and so on. And there'll be a determination made about, subject to resources, what the right benchmark there is. And then I think this, again, it's bringing us back to the overall discussion about the importance of the programmatic design, and then the importance of the monitoring and evaluation and follow-up. And so if you take, for example, if it was education, then assessing whether or not that's facilitating more children to be able to be in school in a particular, or the children in a particular family. So I think it's a very good point, and it's absolutely part of the overall programme design, which goes right from the beginning through to an assessment of whether or not the cash has been effective and met the needs.
Massimo?
I just also wanted to react to one of the points that Jeff raised earlier about if an international organization violates one of the these international principles on data protection. What do you do? Where do you take? Where you cannot take them to court? And it's true. I mean, the regime of immunities means that an international organization cannot be taken to court. However, it's not so simple. And in setting up a system of compliance on personal data protection, we followed very much the example of an interesting organization that has got nothing to do with humanitarian work, Interpol, and the jurisprudence that Interpol has in French courts, particularly where they have their headquarters, where obviously when your personal data is being processed by Interpol, you don't tend to be very happy. And you tend to want to find any possible reason to challenge the fact that Interpol is processing your personal information. So already since the 80s, people were going to domestic courts in France and saying the processing of my personal data by Interpol is against the French data protection law, and so they need to stop. And Interpol said immunity from jurisdiction, and the French courts were saying, okay, immunity from jurisdiction, yet France has signed the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 6. We have an obligation to ensure that people that are on our territory have got access to a court. So immunity from jurisdiction is compatible from this with this right, provided that Interpol sets up an equivalent system to provide an effective remedy. And so, since the 80s, as far as I understand, Interpol established this independent commission that actually acts as a court. And so when we set up our system of compliance and data protection, the ICRC Assembly amended the statutes of the ICRC to create a new governing body that is an independent commission precisely to deal with cases of complaints. Admittedly, we haven't received any complaints so far. Generally, people tend to be happier when it is the ICRC that processes personal information of people than Interpol. But if there is a problem where people have concerns about the processing of personal data by the ICRC, there is this independent commission that will that has decision-making powers in relation to the processing by the ICRC.
Yeah, Jeff, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, well, clearly let's go back to the 1946 UN Convention on Immunities, because one of the things that's implicit in the 1946 convention is that the UN was set up its own independent system for dealing with complaints. But we saw in Haiti with the cholera outbreak and a few other situations that occasionally this doesn't quite happen. But I would agree with you. The UN, and I know the ICRC is not part of the UN, but the UN at least, since 2012, it has adopted rule of law standards for itself as well as for all the operations. And I would suggest that rule of law requires that the UN has these independent mechanisms to check on what it's doing and what it's not doing. There was something that Philomena started off her presentation by referring to Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and talking about human dignity. I think that cash-based transfers clearly make the displaced person much more independent, much more autonomous, and add to their dignity. So we should want this to work, and we should put in place mechanisms that would help it work. But one question that I've not seen an answer to anywhere, so I'm actually asking a question. How far does cash-based transfer assist in preventing gender-based discrimination amongst refugee populations?
Very interesting question. So, Philomena again.
So I think, again, it takes you back to the specific programme, and I understand that in certain contexts there will be a decision that the cash is to be provided to the female in a household, for example. But again, that's going to be a matter for the particular programme, the particular population that are being assisted, and then dependent as well on follow-up monitoring and evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Massimo, have you experienced specific cases? No. So, have you heard Philomena's answer?
I have heard Philomena's answer.
Okay. So, any other question? So, thank you so much, Jeff. Would you like to say something before going back to...
I just want to apologise to everybody for my useless added something. I also just want to say it's actually much more difficult when you're on Skype to have that interaction that allows you to fit in with the other panelists. So apologies in particular to you, Catherine, to Philomena and to Massimo for not being able to participate and to be able to bounce ideas off each other in the way that would have facilitated the discussion in general. So I'm just going to say sorry.
No problem, Jeff. You've been the star of the day anyway. So, thank you. So, Massimo, anything to wrap up? What about the future? So
the future, as far as we can see, is really to get thorough about risk analysis. And I think I went on and on and on and on and on throughout the presentation about this risk analysis, so I will not go any further. But for me, it's been really a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure actually we will be able to discuss it further and to see how our approaches can actually lead us both to do better programs. So,
Philomena, still positive about, of course.
Sure, absolutely. And I think just going back to the, where we started here, I think there's, you could bring the human rights principles that we looked at earlier into two elements of the cash programming. I think the questions that we've had have demonstrated the importance of this. One, the decision about whether cash is the right modality, and then secondly, if it is being delivered in the form of cash, how that program is designed. And I think the principles, while we have to then operationalize them, I think those principles actually serve us very well.
So thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to IHL for hosting this wonderful roundtable. Have a nice time.